Welcome to the AI Explainability Roundtable, looking at AI explainability statements. This is our fourth event at cogX, and we've spent a lot of time now talking to lots of slides and lecturing people in all sorts of ways. So we want to do something a bit different at this session. And we're going to talk about AI explainability statements, which are a new and emerging product that needs to be basically put in place for all sorts of regulatory reasons we'll talk about. But because it's new and evolving, we want to make sure this is a broader conversation than just us talking. Clearly, we have views on the topics, but we want to make sure that we try and bring as many people into this conversation as possible. So warning up front, we're going to ask you all to put stuff into the chat, and we really would encourage you to come up and speak on stage as well to try and make sure that this is a fully rounded conversation that we're all involved in. So Simon, if I go to the first slide, please. So the aim today really is a fewfold. Firstly, we just want to explain and introduce AI explainability statements. So we're all on the same page in terms of understanding what these are, where they're coming from, what the purpose of them is, what the underlying legal question marks and focus on them is. And then I want to discuss as a group 3 key questions. Firstly, what are you trying to explain? And clearly, explainability in the context of AI has all sorts of different ramifications and different ways of thinking about it. So we want to go through that, but try and capture as much as possible the group's views on this, the group's ideas, because this is still a space that is evolving. Second, then, it would be good to talk about the stakeholders. What's the point? Who do these explainability statements need to be made for? What's the purpose of them? Who are you trying to communicate to? And coming out of that is, what's the sort of language and the level of understanding you expect in the audience when you're putting together an explainability statement? And third question then is, how should you begin to think as an organization about creating one? What are the approaches that maybe some people in the audience have already taken? What are the challenges they might face? And we'll talk a bit about that and then try and bring it back to how this can be done, how we're doing this already with various organizations, and really how you could take this forward in terms of next steps. But I just want to emphasize that we're going to talk about this, we'll set the stage, but at this stage, this whole area is still evolving. So we want to hear as many voices as possible and really try and make sure this is a rounded conversation rather than just us talking and telling the world what we think. So in terms of who's on stage, at this stage, we have 3 of us. My name is Tim Gordon. I'm co-managing partner at Best Practice AI. I have my background is in digital transformation, but also work in politics and government, so the whole regulatory side as well. We very much focus on helping startups, corporates, investors work in this space. My colleague, Simon Greenman, the co-managing partner, he's been in the world of AI since before the last AI winter. He studied it many years ago, but also helped build one of the first AI relevant mapping companies, MapQuest.com, back in the early days of the internet. He is now on the World Economic Forum's Global AI Council, and together we've done a whole bunch of work with the World Economic Forum on the board AI and how boards should think about interacting with AI. And finally, it's great to have our partner, Minesh Tanna, here from Simmons & Simmons. He is a solicitor specializing in technology-related disputes, but he leads the AI group at Simmons & Simmons, and he speaks regularly and works in the space in a whole series of different formats. As a group, we've come together also with Jacob Turner, who is a barrister at Fountain Court Chambers, who literally wrote the book on robot rules and the whole AI legal world. We've done a bunch of different pieces of work in the space, but the thing that kind of ties us together is a very common sense that it is trust that will help organizations use AI for sustainable competitive advantage. If you don't embed trust at the very, very heart of everything you're doing with AI, you're going to struggle to capture some of the commercial and organizational benefits that can be captured from this phenomenal new technology. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Minesh to talk a bit more about what we mean when we talk about AI explainability statements.
And hi, everyone. And as Tim mentioned, it would be very helpful to hear your views on, because much of this is not set in stone, and even some of the legal provisions that we'll look at shortly are subject to interpretation, and this is generally a very new area. Now, explainability, as I'm sure you're all aware, features very heavily in the ethical AI discourse, or sometimes referred to as responsible AI or trustworthy AI. So if you look at the 200+ frameworks that exist around ethical or responsible AI, you will frequently see a reference to explainability or transparency. And I think the EU has this sort of formula that the high-level expert group used when it issued principles a few years ago now, one of which was explainability. And what the EU's view is, and I think this is very sensible, is the following. AI is a very nascent technology. We don't yet understand it, but we do want to foster it because we do recognize that it can bring benefits. But in order to do that, we need to be able to trust it. And in order to be able to trust it, we need to know more about it. And so those using AI or involved in its development need to be transparent about how it works and how they're using it. And to the extent possible, it needs to be explained. And I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And that's why you see explainability in all of these frameworks and in the discourse on ethical AI. Now, it's a misconception or a misunderstanding to think that it only exists in the ethical or responsible AI world, which of course consists of non-binding or non-legally binding frameworks. Now, actually, and it's a slightly lesser known part of the GDPR, it actually contains a legal obligation relating to explainability. And it's in Articles 13, 14, and 15, which we've set out on the slides here. And essentially, where personal data is being used in the context of automated decision-making, and I think our view would be that that would include personal data being used in an AI system, that in those circumstances, the data subject, that is the person whose personal data is being used, has the right to be provided with meaningful information about the logic involved. Now, if you're looking at those words and thinking they're not very clear, you'd be absolutely right to think that. The first issue is that the GDPR wasn't actually drafted with artificial intelligence in mind. It was actually based on a more historic piece of legislation, and that's why this doesn't fit very well in the context of AI. But that is, we would say, an explainability obligation. Now, the other slight oddity is that it refers to providing meaningful information about the logic involved. Now, I guess one way of looking at AI systems is they don't actually use logic in a traditional conventional computing sense. They don't follow a sort of decision tree as most computer programs do. If X, then Y. In a purely non-deterministic system where the AI technology has some autonomy, arguably there is no actual logic involved. But you would take a broad interpretation of this, and we'll come on to look at two cases in which that was actually tested. And there is an obligation to provide meaningful information. Now, there is still uncertainty about what needs to be said about the AI system, and we'll come on to talk and hopefully hear from you about what exactly needs to be explained about the AI system. But I mentioned a couple of cases, which I'll just mention briefly now. The first time we think this has been tested is in the Dutch courts quite recently. And it was a case brought by drivers employed by two ride-hailing companies, Uber and Ola. And essentially, Uber and Ola were using partially or fully automated decision-making processes to either fine drivers for committing some sort of fraud, or worse still, firing them from their jobs. And the drivers said, well, look, you're using automated decision making in order to take those decisions. You're using my personal data. Under this provision of the GDPR, you are obliged to give me meaningful information about the logic involved. And where there's, fully automated decision making, I am entitled to human intervention. Now, the Dutch courts relatively recently handed down judgments in those cases. And I think Ola came off slightly worse than Uber. Uber's fraud determinations were not, the court said, fully automated because there were humans in the loop, as we tend to say in the AI community. Now, that is being appealed because there's a question as to whether those humans were sort of nominally involved in the process and not actually properly involved in the decision making. So it'll be interesting to see what the courts say about that. And there'll be some hopefully useful comments about what this phrase human in the loop means. But Uber was nevertheless asked to disclose data and models which were used as the basis for the dismissal of the two drivers. And equally, Ola's decision, the court went further and said Ola's decision to deduct earnings from their drivers was a fully automated decision-making process. And therefore, the drivers had the rights that you see on the screen here. They had the right to be provided with meaningful information about the logic involved. So the key takeaway from that really is, or two key takeaways, I would say, there is a legal obligation in certain circumstances to explain how your AI system operates. And the second takeaway is that there's not yet sufficient clarity on what that means. And I think it would be very helpful to hear from the audience as to what their views are on what exactly needs to be explained when revealing or disclosing information about AI systems.
Fantastic, thank you. So Simon, can you jump to the next slide? This is the bit where we go interactive and we get a bit more experimental. Back, Simon, please. Question we want to ask you is simply this: what do you think should or can be explained with an AI explainability statement? So what exactly is it that needs to be explained in an AI system to get out there and convince the world that things are happening transparently? There are two ways you could do this. One is, please whack what you think into the chat. We'd love to hear as much from the chat. But equally, we're very keen that if anyone wants to come on stage and give us their views, that'd be fantastic. There is, I think, a blue button you can push, which is saying share your audio and video. And I can invite you onto stage to come and talk. So please, let's use this. It's a small group, so there's no need to feel shy. Please do give us your views through the chat and or come up on stage and tell us what you think should be explained in an AI system. And obviously there are a bunch of different ways of thinking about this, whether it is in terms of the sort of the end results or the way the system works. So we'd love to get your views. So Jacob, thank you. Would you like to join us on stage? Happy with the chat, fine, fair enough. So Jacob has put down types of data being fed into AI ML models. So starting with the data. Simon,
so that one there, I think Jacob would be a machine learning model takes as input various data's features. And so what you're suggesting is in the explainability statement, you need to say clearly what the data features as being fed into the model are. Is that what you're thinking, Jacob? So, and also Jacob's suggesting that part of the explainability statement should be a brief description of how the model works, preferably co-design with someone who's similar to those effective. So how does the algorithm come to the decision that it does? What's the sort of logic behind it? So if you feed in various variables, how does the algorithm come out? And obviously that's quite straightforward if you've got things like decision trees. If age greater than 30, then do something, but more difficult in deep neural networks. We've also got a point about co-design there.
By co-design, do you mean, Jacob, are you saying that effectively you want to make sure there's a diverse group of people who are or stakeholder involved in building those models, and actually you need to articulate the stakeholder set who've been involved in doing it? Which to some extent ties back to what Hannah's saying, which is explain what factors are taken into account to make decisions. And so Hannah's talking about the factors. You're also, Jacob, going one step beyond that and saying who the stakeholders have been involved in these processes are.
I think just on the factors point, I think that's really an important point, isn't it? And Simon, we've been doing some work recently on deep neural networks where, I mean, it might be helpful, Simon, if you could give a brief explanation of weights and features in terms of how they operate within a neural net, because it is possible sometimes to identify the features that the system is assessing. So let's say you've got a neural net that's trying to determine what a particular sentence means. You might be able to work out what features the system is looking at in order to determine what the sentence means. It might be looking at the words, the word order. It might be looking at synonyms of the words. But what it's really difficult, I think, to explain is the weight that the model is attributing to each of those features in a really complex neural net. Is that, Simon, I'll let you talk a bit more about that, because I think that's quite an important point about the black box and explainability.
Yeah, and there's quite a few questions coming in there, Hannah, Joanna, about that. I mean, that's the key thing about deep neural networks is they have inputs, which would be features, I don't know, age or sentence or words, that sort of thing, an input coming into the model. And they have an output, which is this sentence means the following, we predict the following. So, but in the middle between the input and output are lots and lots of layers of effectively neurons with lots and lots of interconnections. And the complexity there is you're actually getting models today from the likes of Google that has not billions of neurons and interconnections, but trillions at this point. So that's why it's sort of described as a black box, because you don't know what's going on in all these layers here. It seems to be this sort of electrical effect going on. But to Manesh's point, explainability of deep neural networks is always going to be an approximation, because the model in itself is actually the explanation, but you can't understand 1.3 trillion parameters. So how do you actually have approximations of that? And there's lots of tools being provided by open source, by big tech, to do approximations that help us understand these models. So for example, Lime is a common open source tool that allows us to say, okay, we have these three variables as input, that seems to correlate the most with output. So Lime is one way of doing it. Another tool in language models is basically what you see is if you have this sentence coming in, then it clusters very similar to these sentences over here, so therefore must have the same or a similar type of meaning. So all of these sorts of different tools for explainability, and there's a huge investments going on here, are approximations that basically allow us as humans to at least have some level of understanding of what's going on here.
Yeah, and I think Jasper's point and then Jacob's comment subsequently, it's very difficult, isn't it, to always explain the weightings that the model is attributing to each of the features or variables that it's taking into account. And I think just taking a step back and from a very layperson perspective, which is usually where the perspective I'm coming from it is that this means that it's quite difficult to explain in any given instance how the AI system has reached a particular decision. If you're using an AI system to assess a job applicant's CV or application form and come out with a score of that, it's quite difficult to say how it's done that in that particular instance. You have to resort to a more general explanation of how it's doing that more generally, for want of a better word. Is that fair, Simon?
Yeah, that's fair. You do have to do it more generally. But the models that are coming out today, like Lime, other techniques like counterfactual techniques, at least start to help us have confidence in the way it's making decisions. So Lime, for example, will say, okay, we recommend this candidate because this candidate has the following features as input. They have this much experience in computer science. They've worked for these types of companies. So it really sort of highlights the input variables that are the most important. So these three variables out of these 10 variables really are emphasized as being the key influence on that decision. Another technique you often see as counterfactual techniques is, okay, if we have these three things that are most important to a mortgage decision, age, income, location, and you're approved. Now, if we change one of those variables like income, and we take your income down from 50,000 to 30,000 pounds, and we take, it's called a counterfactual example, then suddenly the decision goes from yes, we approve to no, we don't approve. So that's another technique, is sort of counterfactual, to play with the input variables to see when a decision changes from yes to no, or from one classification to another.
So Matt has just come in with a great point, which is sort of bringing it away from the technical mathematical rigor type questions to actually how the human feels in this. So the cultural point about machines and models making decisions might be behind the mistrust. Is it about the feeling of being heard and being able to challenge as much as the maths and rigor of the model? So that's something that needs to be an explainability statement.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, well, firstly, from the legal perspective, depending on how you interpret the GDPR provisions we were just looking at, there is an obligation to actually explain the logic, subject to that slightly esoteric point about whether or not there is any logic involved in AI. But I think that word logic does mean that you've got to explain a bit about what we're talking about now in terms of weights and features, potentially, subject to how that would be interpreted by courts, etc. But I think it probably does require a bit more of a detailed explanation. I'm not sure you can just stop at saying, oh, we'll give you a very brief description of how this AI system works. Because I think the whole point is there might be a job candidate who gets rejected and says, well, I need you to tell me why your AI system has scored my CV so low or rejected me for this job. And I think as a society, if a human is unable to provide that explanation, there's a bit of an issue, I think, even if it might be the right decision, and we all agree as humans looking at that CV or application that it should be scored, lowly or rejected for the job. I think there is an issue if we can't explain why the AI system has reached that answer.
So does that mean also that organizations basically need to be very clear around the processes they've got to sort of deal with the sort of issues that Matt's raising of people coming through and saying, what happened here? Is that part of what the explainability statement should probably capture?
I think so, yeah. I mean, the way that I think organizations using AI systems like that deal with that problem is to say, well, what we've done in our testing and training process is to review all of the decisions that the AI system has made and to check as humans that we agree with those. And that's how we know that the AI system is performing accurately, even though we can't explain each decision. But that still doesn't deal with the problem of when you get new data, when the AI system is deployed in a live environment and you're unable to explain how it's reached that decision in that particular case. But I do think, Tim, you're right, that if you can't explain how the AI system has reached the decision because we're dealing with a complicated neural net where we just can't look at the features and the weights and understand it, then yes, a lot of it is about processes. We should be asking organizations, how have you assured yourself that the AI system is operating accurately? How many hours of testing have you done? How many use cases have you looked at? So yeah, I definitely think that's right.
So I think Hannah's made a great point, which is we need to explain where in the process AI is used and where it isn't used. You have these sort of organizations that sort of present themselves as being these sort of AI monoliths, and actually really digging below that is quite interesting. Okay. Jacob, just a reminder, anyone in the audience wants to come on stage and talk, please feel free, just push the button and I will let you up. But if the chat is a better way of doing it, that's entirely fine as well. We're not pushing people on stage if they don't want to. So Matt's case is unique. I'm not sure which case are you talking about, Matt? Just to Jacob says GDPR is to do with ensuring that data is collected for a specific definable purpose. Should the purpose of the AI decision-making process be reiterated in the explainability statement?
Yeah, I mean, is it worth just turning to our ICO slide to look at?
Yeah, so maybe what we'll sort of, unless someone wants to jump in and talk, what we'll jump to is actually the work has been done on some of this. So let's try and bring that together. And I'll show over to you.
Yeah, and I think this will answer Hannah's last point and also Jacob's last point, because the slight criticism I have of all these ethical AI frameworks, and indeed that wording in the GDPR that we've been looking at, is it doesn't provide much guidance about exactly what needs to be explained. Now, you might be aware of the ICO and Turing's work in this area, and they've produced a very detailed set of documents identifying how you go about explaining your use of AI, and it's a really good effort, and I think it's the best we've got currently in terms of guidance as to what needs to be explained. And the ICO identifies 6 types of explanation that they think should comprise an explainability statement, and I won't go through them in detail. You've seen them on the slide there, but it's things like rationale, and I think that goes to Hannah's last point. You've got to be explaining within your overall architecture where AI is used and where it's not used, and also why you're using AI. And as a lawyer, a common concept that I come across a lot is proportionality. And I think a question will always be asked about AI. Do you need to be using AI to do this? Why can't you just use a manual process where we're much more in control as humans and we understand how decisions have been reached? So what are your aims of using AI, and is AI a legitimate way of achieving that aim? Then there are other types of explanation. Responsibility, that's about who's involved, and that's the human in the loop point. Data, I think, was one of the comments we had right at the start. You've got to be able to explain what data is being used to train the AI system, to test it, and then what data is going to be used in the live environment. Fairness is a big one, and that's a lot about how you've dealt with bias and discriminatory effects, or potential bias and discriminatory effects of the AI system. Safety is a lot about technical robustness of the system. How do you deal with issues like concept and data drift? How do you ensure it's accurate? Is it vulnerable to cyber attacks? And then impact, which is a kind of more contextual macro point that I think some people have also mentioned, is, is it fair to be using this AI system, and what are the impacts of using it on wider society? And I think that recruitment example I gave is quite important. I definitely would want to know, if I ever went and applied for a job and an AI system rejected me, I'd want to know exactly why it has rejected me. In the same way that you ask humans for feedback, I'd be wanting a human to give me feedback from the AI system.
Yeah. But Manesh, on that point of fairness, and a slight tangent, but is it also not true an AI system can be more fair in the recruitment process because they ask the same questions and consistently measure people, as opposed to humans can be very biased when they interview people. Humans can be tired after lunch, so their judgment might differ in things. So it's fairness both ways, is it not?
I think that's right, Simon. I think it's important, and this is a criticism I also have about the way that people talk about AI. For some reason, there's an expectation that AI needs to perform perfectly, even though as humans, we often act in a way which is far from perfect. So why do we hold AI to much higher standards than we hold fellow humans? I mean, take AI in law enforcement. In the US and now in the UK, there are issues around using facial recognition technology, for example, in law enforcement. But it's probably far more accurate and probably has far less bias and discrimination than humans in law enforcement. And I don't think that's unfair to say. So I do agree. I think an AI system can actually, in a lot of circumstances, be more fair. But because we're at the early stage of AI adoption and deployment, I think people just need extra reassurance that this type of technology is going to be fair. So I think in the short term, we do seem to hold AI to a higher standard, and maybe that's justified.
Yeah.
So building on that, the next question we want to ask ourselves, and by the way, any comments on this is all appreciated. We'll go back to them. But I think the next question says, so we've worked out here are the different things that we should be explaining and various ways to think about how we explain them. The second question is, who should you be explaining it to? I mean, who are the stakeholders here who matter? What's the sort of the way you need to think about articulating your explanation? Because some of the conversation we've had in the past 20 minutes would be bluntly gobbledygook to your average listener. What is the not on this call, of course, but in the general population, who should you be thinking about explaining things to, and what therefore level of editorial needs to go into this? So I'd just love any chat comments on this. And once again, if anyone wants to jump on screen, they're very, very welcome.
Tim, I think this goes back to Joanna's comment earlier on about speaking about our thoughts on the different stakeholders.
Fully agree.
And whether you can have potentially one explainability statement for all stakeholders, or whether you need to produce different ones depending on the stakeholders. I mean, Tim, do you just maybe want to speak about our thoughts on that in the context of the last few explainability statements we've done?
I mean, one of the interesting questions, as Manesh says, is you end up sort of potentially providing different levels of explainability. So you want some things that potentially work in some detail with, for example, regulators. Regulators hopefully employ people who can come through and ask the hard questions and understand some of the technical subjects. But equally, you want something that's going to be of use for citizens. So if you're the employment example you gave, Manesh, where effectively you're in a position where someone may or may not get a job, and they say, well, why is that? You do want to explain that in terms that are open to people who may not have advanced degrees in maths or data science. And then somewhere in the middle, you've got, for example, if you're a business that is selling your AI tool into other businesses, those businesses will need to have explainability statements at some stage to justify what they're doing, but you will have a level of differing levels of expertise across your B2B client base. And so you find yourself at a place where, is one document going to fit all those groups or not? And that's, I think, one of the challenges we're still working through, to be honest, which is, do you want a sort of one paragraph or one sentence summary? Probably not going to work, but maybe will work for different circumstances. And then a sort of detailed 600-page manual at the back end for when a regulator brings in a full team to try and understand what's happening. And you've really got to try and create something that works in the middle here. And I think what we're trying to focus on, we'll come to it later, is a simplified version of this that actually works across most stakeholder groups, but is also capable of being synthesized down enough to be, deployed on a web page in a consumer-facing role.
And the way we've done that is to essentially make it as non-technical as possible. And I think we've even sort of said to ourselves, let's aim to make this comprehensible to an 18-year-old who doesn't have much understanding of complex stats or maths. And I think that's quite a helpful approach, because obviously any data subject, you've got to assume that they don't really understand AI, which is probably going to be the case. So it should be non-technical and accessible to them. Regulators, of course, a lot of their focus is on protecting consumers. So if you've developed an explainability statement that is accessible and comprehensible to an average consumer, then you'd hope a regulator would have some sympathy and actually endorse the fact that you've done that. And then board members as well. You know, I think we've got to assume that they won't have a high level of understanding of AI. So that sort of very basic level explainability statement in non-technical terms would hopefully work for C-suite and board members as well. And just a note on that point, the FCA was talking a lot about AI in 2019. And they said, as a regulator, we will expect board members to be able to explain their organization's use of AI. So they will need to be able to do that in due course, at least in the financial services industry.
So a great comment here from Jacob Andrews. My research is healthcare, and the obvious stakeholder in this arena is the patient, who may have had a wide range of backgrounds and levels of experience and knowledge about AI. It is difficult to know how to target explanations that are clear but not patronizing to a very wide group like patients. No clear answer yet from my research. So that's I think aligned with a lot of experience people are having. But I think the point is you do need to be able to go to as wide a group as possible to be in a place where you're going to satisfy the regulator. I think that's an important point. We kind of, I personally have a sort of bet that sometime in the next 3 years, chief executives can lose their job because they cannot explain what their AI system is doing. They cannot therefore justify it. So it seems to me that's a big challenge coming down the track. If you could jump to the next slide, Simon, just in terms of some of those stakeholders that we think you need to be explaining things to. Clearly customers, in terms of really being clear. And I think the bit here is if you can't explain it to your customers, they're unlikely to trust you. And if they don't trust you, they're going to be far more resistant to working with you. So if you don't get that transparency, that explainability going, you'll effectively be at a cost disadvantage because they won't share the data with you on, for example, a consumer proposition you want to build. Suppliers, and this is both suppliers and actually sort of B2B customers, if you're trying to sell your service into organizations that will then use it elsewhere. I think what we're beginning to see in some of our big corporates we talk to is that actually they're increasingly setting now expectations for their supplier base in terms of the AI startups and the AI companies and the AI providers they work with around some of these questions. And clearly an explainability statement is going to be an increasingly important part of that mix. Third, staff internally, and this is both in terms of reassuring staff when AI is being used in a way that might have an impact on them, but also it's important in terms, I think, articulating inside an organization where there may be gaps or issues emerging. And so what we find when we've done explainability statements is that what you can pretty quickly pinpoint as part of the feedback is these are the next set of questions you need to be thinking about internally. You know, is your training in the right place? Have you really worked through some of the potential bias issues around these data sets? Have you really worked with your suppliers to nail down some of the challenges coming down the track? Regulators absolutely critical, and you know, we found that those conversations are very positive around people coming forward with explainability statements. But this is a place where the regulators are going to get more and more involved. And I think one of the big picture lessons we can see at the moment is that, you know, the regulators aren't going to wait as long as they might once have done for the issues to emerge. They're going to be far more proactive, and therefore the more organizations can be on the front foot in terms of explaining to regulators where they're at, the better off they'll be. And finally, society. Society is going to make, you know, whether the media or pressure groups or interest groups are increasingly going to have very strong views on how these tools are being used. The TUC, for example, has recently come out with a big report on AI and HR, which is fantastic. They're really focusing on that and beginning to think where it might go. And once again, if you haven't done the thinking that enables you to produce an explainability statement, often organizations will struggle when they suddenly face a moment of crisis. So getting this sort of thing in place early on and quickly is often quite a powerful tool for being ready for whatever the winds may blow in, as and when the AI begins to get questioned, as almost inevitably it will be, given the current state of discussion. So Simon, over to you for the final question, which is, if you're an organization thinking about this, what is the best way to start thinking about how to pull this together? How can organizations actually create an AI explainability statement? And I'd love in the chat to hear from people who've done this. It'd be brilliant if they have. People who are thinking about doing this. People who can think already of the problems that might emerge or the opportunities this might create. So just think through what this might mean for either your clients or your organizations in terms of creating this topic?
Yeah, and so to add to that question, how has your organization, for example, have the data scientists actually explained this? How has the marketing person described their AI marketing system? And there's not a right or wrong here, but curious to see how organizations have actually explained things.
I mean, for what it's worth, we find that the process of building an explainability statement is often one of the key steps to sort of, as I say, unearthing and having a broader discussion with the organization around some of the issues that emerge that are sort of the broader AI question marks that we've all been discussing at cogX these past few days, and whether it's bias or use cases and so on. And
it'd be also interesting to hear from those in organizations who haven't created an AI explainability statement. Is there anything holding you back as to why that's not been done yet?
So what, to add a bit of thoughts here from what we've been doing with our clients, and I think the theme that really is coming out here is this is an evolution here, it's a journey. We've never really had complex AI systems at the level of dimensionality, pattern recognition, complexity that we've seen before. So we're all learning together how explainability can work in the context of explaining it to your customers and the lay sort of person. But broadly, what we see when we work with our clients, the sort of process that we go through to do explainability statements relates back to what Manesh was saying. How do we explain it from a rational perspective, responsibility perspective? How do we explain the data? How do we explain fairness? How do we explain safety? And how do we explain the impact? So what we would do in an organization is go in and look at these different areas, talk cross-functionally to different groups, put together what we call a long-form explainability statement. So, for example, we will spend time with the data science, data engineering team, the algorithm and model team, and we would be asking things like, can you give us an overview of the life cycle of the data? How did you, early in the life cycle of the data, identify where the data comes from? How do you collect that data? How do you process that data? How do you make sure the integrity of that data? And also look at the sampling of that data from a question of bias perspective. Do you have different represented groups? So one area we look at is that whole sort of data life cycle. We would then look at the operation of the AI system from a modeling perspective, and it goes back to a lot of the earlier questions. What are the inputs and outputs? What's the algorithm that's being used here? Is it using sort of buzzwords going around? Is it deep neural network and RNN, CNN? There's loads of buzzwords here. But what we try and do is sort of demystify and put a spotlight on the choice of algorithms, the input and output, and then look at how that algorithm actually operates. And frankly, what have the data science team done to look at the functioning of that algorithm? So those are just some of the questions that we look at in putting together a data set, a explainability statement. We'll also go back, and to Manesh's point, is what is the context of this AI system? Why was it chosen? How does it impact people? And why was AI chosen over other forms? So there is a fairly systematic approach that we take to working with organizations to put together those explainability statements.
So Hannah's put a comment in. I haven't done this yet, but I would assume we'd need to create one for each AI feature we build. It will follow a formula that covers what, why, what, data it uses, who it affects, perhaps. I think the question is, do you need one for each AI feature, or can you do one for your broader AI mix?
Yeah, and the thing here is you've got a system. AI doesn't exist in a vacuum. AI is often part of a system. There can be multiple AI features. So what we find with our clients is there would be different AI modules used within different technologies. So generally what we would do is the explainability statement would broadly be the input and output of the overall system, but we do need to dig in and look at the individual AI modules and see that how those work. So for example, what you would see in, let's say, a chatbot system is there would be a module for natural language processing, language models. We'd want to understand how that works. the output of that natural language processing might be, I have a cold, I have a cough, and there might be another module system involved in trying to diagnose it. So you'll have a language AI system, you will have a diagnostic system, and there might be further search systems. You can see a whole series of modules come together in a system.
So Matt's got a couple of great points here. On the data lifecycle point, do you see the need for farm to fork type approach as the AI and algorithms will increasingly be part of a much wider ecosystem or supply chain? The AI may be hidden elsewhere. So to the point you made, Simon, do you need to look beyond our own organizations, the whole AI provisioning route? So the supply chain.
Yes, and I'd also like Manesh's perspective here, but the reality is, and one of the big risks that organizations I don't think have fully understood is your whole AI tech stack will involve third-party systems. It could be third-party proprietary systems from vendor. It could be third-party systems from open source. And one of the things for natural language processing, for example, that many, many companies will use is language models that are produced by Google, Facebook, and other big tech. And you very much have to ask the question, are those language models, what are the risks associated with those language models? And we know some of the risks of those language models are biased because the language models are trained on huge corpuses of data, millions, billions of Wikipedia articles and so on. And so those language models learn, reflect, and amplify human biases in tech. So the answer is absolutely, you do have to look at third-party AI modules and data.
But I think to build on that, particularly corporates who are sort of bringing in a whole bunch of different products, often from sometimes quite small suppliers, they will increasingly be saying, you know, you need to explain to us exactly how this is working. And that's going to be increasingly part of the whole procurement process. And so if you're a part of that procurement process, the faster you are in a position to just provide it, the better. And if you're on the purchasing side, then understanding where things stand and where things are going. I mean, we talked yesterday about the Deutsche Telekom model. They're clearly doing that already. So you can begin to see how this is something that's going to be increasingly important part of the whole AI stack, as Simon was saying.
Yeah, and the good news is there's a lot of procurement guidelines coming out for AI. The British government worked with the World Economic Forum for procurement guidelines to help ensure responsible AI. Sorry, Manesh, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's important to note that there's no fixed approach here in terms of what needs to be and doesn't need to be included in an AI explainability statement. And the ones that we've done as a group, they have developed organically to some extent as well, because, and this is a slightly separate point, but I think it's an important point. And what I've realized that there are a lot of incidental benefits that come out of going through the process of creating an AI explainability statement. So it flushes out lots more information about your AI systems that perhaps other bits of your organization weren't aware of. And it forces data scientists to think, why have we done it in this way? And should we actually be amending some of our methods or techniques? Or do we actually need better processes in place to monitor the AI system and update it in the future? And I think the really big one from a kind of governance perspective, and that's always quite a nebulous concept, but as a lawyer, I'm finding that organizations' legal teams are well behind the curve in terms of understanding how their organization is using AI, because it's the corporate, business, commercial, data science teams that are leaping ahead and using this technology, and the lawyers are still playing catch up. And so one thing that going through this process does is really help to give the lawyers a sense of, how are we using AI and what are the legal risks that I could be facing here? So I think it really helps to bridge the gap between those who are using AI in an organization and those who need to be aware of how it's being used. And so going through that process really helps from a governance perspective.
Yeah. So just do drop final questions into the chat. We can go more broad now. Do the big tech providers already provide explainability statements?
So it's a great question. I was just looking at that. I mean, there's no, to Manesh's point, there's no one standard definition of what explainability means, but big tech absolutely does understand that some form of explainability is going to be critical for the use of their technologies. So Salesforce is very good in this area. They provide a lot of tools actually to help their hundreds of thousands of customers generate explainability. So they're actually an enabler to help their customers generate explainability. Google is pushing something called model cards, which I like. And model cards is basically an overview of how an algorithm works. Input, output, the type of algorithm selected, CNN versus RNN, all these buzzwords, that sort of thing. And also some assessment of how the model works under different circumstances. Is it biased? Is it, or how they dealt with bias and things. So there's some great approaches coming from big tech. They recognize that fundamentally, without explainability and visibility, then trust is going to be a key issue here. So we expect to see a lot, but you couldn't just take a Google model card and present that to the regulator. There wouldn't be enough. You have to put a lot more context around that and a lot more detail, as we've talked about here. But it certainly helps what they're doing.
Yeah, although I think they should be doing a lot more, and they can be doing a lot more. I mean, you can buy off-the-shelf Google NLP models that you can plug into your own AI systems, but you're not quite sure, you know, how much bias there is in those models or how much testing has been done. And I think actually big tech providers have a you know, this is just a common theme generally, I need to be careful what I say, but I think there should be a greater onus on them to be explaining exactly how they've come up with these models.
Yeah.
Great. So any last questions before we move to close? Simon, you want to next slide?
Okey-doke. Right. Yeah, so just wrapping up here, what we are working on with a number of clients who've talked about is really how to put together a process to be able to understand how the different dimensions of the AI, their client's AI system work. And we put that together in what we believe is something acceptable to regulators, something that will be acceptable and understandable by the 18-year-old in the form of a short form explainability statement. Apologies for the redaction here. But we're generally, what we see it comes together is answering a number of questions. It's about 5 to 10 pages long, based on the long form explainability statement. But the key here is really striking the balance, and Jacob talked about it earlier, is how do you explain an AI system to the general population with enough detail that people can get it, with the right metaphors, with the right language, people can get it without being patronizing. And we think at this stage of the evolution of the industry, we've got something that's workable and frankly is really a case study for what's being done around the world at this point.
Hannah, does this apply to all AIs and it does not have a human impacting outcome? Does it matter? So if it's not having an impact on humans, do you need an explainability statement? Minesh?
I think the short answer is yes, but you know, I think I always find this a fascinating point that we get on aeroplanes every day and we don't understand how they. I certainly don't understand how they fly, but I still have trust in them. I've heard that, you know, there have been surveys done where in a healthcare context, coming back to Jacob's point, patients, if they're, you know, getting diagnosed or treated by an AI system, don't really care how it works as long as it's accurate and does the job. But I do think, irrespective of the outcome and the impact of humans, we're at that stage where, in order to build trust in AI, and particularly to encourage big tech to be explaining how they're using AI and developing these systems that do ultimately, in time, have the capabilities of having a profound effect on society, there does need to be an explanation as to all AI systems. They all need to be explained to some extent, and the context will matter. So I think the detail and what needs to be explained will vary depending on the context. But Hannah, in response to your question, my view is certainly yes. It all needs to be explained,
even in the context of GDPR as well, Minesh?
Yeah, I mean, GDPR obviously operates in the context where there's personal data being used by the AI system, but you know, that will be fairly typical in a lot of AI systems. So you know, that is a legal obligation there as well. So that can't be ignored.
Right. And then the other point you made, Hannah, I think, is that clients down the track will increasingly need to understand, to the point that's made made earlier, we need to understand how the whole stack is evolving. And actually, it may be that it has no immediate impact on the humans, but when you go down through that value chain, it may well end up having quite a big impact. So therefore, that will need to ricochet through, and people will need to understand how those different bits come together.
To add to that as well, I mean, increasingly, and Tim made this point earlier, that AI systems will probably lead to a CEO losing their job somewhere down the line because it has broken and it's impacted the reputation and financial outcome of the company. So increasingly, AI systems are going to be in the risk register that will be reported up to the CEO and the board. So we believe very much that the AI system should be, it should apply to all AI systems.
Great. Minesh, Simon, any last words before we close?
Just to say, you know, we've done quite a bit of thinking about the 3 questions that we've posed today. We've done a lot of thinking, as Tim, Simon, you know, about what needs to be explained. So our very long questionnaire seeks to elicit a lot of information from organizations about how they use AI. And then we work together with organizations to answer the second question, which is, you know, how does this translate into an explainability statement for stakeholders? And we can help you to draft this. But I think the key takeaway is really that explainability is now no longer just a nebulous concept that exists in ethical AI frameworks. It is a real obligation, and it is going to become more real and more tangible. And as a lawyer, I expect to see more challenges to organizations who haven't explained their use of AI. So it's a very real topic.
Simon, any closing words?
Yeah, I think that's great. A great overview, but thanks for everyone's time today.
Look, just thank you everyone for taking part. Thank you especially to everyone who took part in the chat. It's been really useful. There's a bunch of great points in there that I know we will take on board and think through. We've got our contact details up on the screen, so please do reach out to us if you're thinking about doing an explainability statement, or if you've done an explainability statement and want to share it with us or discuss these things through. That'd be absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much to all of you, to especially those who commented, but thank you to everyone for being here, and have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.